Hello and welcome to the Car Care Auto Reviews channel, and welcome to the 2024 Nissan Rogue, a very important car for Nissan. And in today's video, we're going to do a proper technical review under the hood. We're going to take a look underneath it. We're going to take a look inside and outside. We're going to talk about some things we like, some things we do not like, right after this. Let's start our technical review under the hood, starting with the engine, because it's a pretty big deal in this car. So the Rogue in 2024 has one engine option, which is the KR15 DDT. It's a variable compression turbo direct injected engine. Very, very interesting engine here. Let us dive in and you'll see why. So at the very top, you have a plastic valve cover. Pretty simple, nothing really special about it. It is a 12-valve engine. I always have to say that with 3 cylinders because it's a very interesting number. So this engine has dual overhead cam. It does have variable valve timing. On the intake, it is electronic. On the exhaust, it is hydraulic. So it has a little actuator in the front. For the electronic variable valve timing, it's an electric motor that spins the inner part of the timing gear. Every time it speeds up faster than the cam speed, it advances the timing. Every time it slows down relative to the cam, it retards the timing. If they spin the same speed, it is base timing. That has been used with many manufacturers successfully. It's actually a really simple and good design. Now, the cylinder head is a single-piece cylinder head without hydraulic lifters. Pretty interesting. This has buckets, so you still have to adjust valve clearance and all that. Kind of a very interesting choice for an engine that is super high-tech, and we'll get to the high-tech part in a second here. So this engine is a timing chain engine. It has 2 timing chains. One of them goes from the cams to the crank, has an internal timing tensioner, which is very, very cool. That's how you want them. The other one goes from the crank to the oil pump, and it has a little mechanical tensioner that has a little spring. Very simple design. That's how you want it. Now, we very quickly glance over the part of the variable compression. That is the biggest deal with this engine. And as the name suggests, this engine has a variable compression, which is the biggest leap in gasoline engine engineering for a while. Let me explain. So most gasoline engine, and when I say most, I mean all gasoline engine except Nissan's variable compression, they have a fixed compression ratio. The way they can vary the combustion is either variable valve timing, either variable valve lift. They'll run the engine on a different cycle, like we've seen a lot of modern engines, kind of switching between Atkinson and modified Miller cycle and all this fancy stuff, but nothing as radical as this. This is the next level. Variable compression. This engine can vary its compression ratio, which is never heard of before, from 8:1 to 14:1. Folks, that is a leap in engineering. That is just a breakthrough, in my humble opinion. And here's how this mega complicated mechanism works. It's actually fascinating. So for lack of a better word, this engine has 2 crankshafts and a very complicated series of rods in between them to effectively change how high the piston goes. But it's actually the opposite of what you think. When you are driving spiritedly or at high load, you're kind of accelerating hard, it will actually lower the compression and allow the turbo to spool up faster. Higher pressure, lower compression, we are safe. We can actually push more power out of this engine. But when we are cruising, and we're not under high load, it'll actually switch to a very high compression and it'll allow the turbo to spool down, less pressure, and now we have the most efficient state. You need very little gasoline, and we are going at a very efficient state at very high compression. I mean, 14:1 compression on a turbo engine is almost unheard of in everyday cars, maybe racing cars, yes, but not everyday cars. But the way this works is what's very interesting. So let's dive into it a little bit. It's going to be hard to explain. I wish we had this engine apart so you can see it, but I'll do my best here to keep it simple but comprehensive. So there are 2 shafts. One of them is the crankshaft. Just like the crankshaft we know, it is connected to the transmission one side, harmonic balancer on the other. It's for lack of a better word, is a normal crankshaft. Then underneath that, there's something called a control shaft. So that control shaft is controlled by a big electric motor that actually changes its angle. And between those two, where the rods normally sit, and you just have a rod and the piston on top, crank goes up kind of in a circle and moves that rod to move the piston up and down, you have a little mechanism that swings back and forth. On one side of this mechanism, you have the rod that connects to the piston. On the other, you have another rod that connects to the control shaft. So when the control shaft pivots, it's going to effectively make this piston go up higher as the crank turns. When it pivots this way, it's going to make it go down where it doesn't go as high in the combustion chamber. When it's not letting it go as high, it is lowering its compression. When it's allowing it to go all the way up to its maximum position, that is high compression. But wait, here's the best part. It's not just switching between 8 and 14. It's infinitely, continuously adjustable. So they can set it at wherever you want in between this range to get the optimum performance, optimum efficiency. That is a breakthrough, folks. I just hope you are into engines to know that that is a giant breakthrough. And with that giant breakthrough come a lot of question marks. The first one being the complication of things. So this 3-cylinder engine that you're, just a little 3-cylinder engine, very cute, very small, very uncomplicated. It has 6 rods. That's when every single one of these rods have bearings, and then the crankshaft with that big mechanism that swings also have bearings. So there's a lot of bearings here. But where it makes up for that a little bit is because of this orientation, because you have your piston rod kind of on the side, it doesn't put side loads on the cylinder walls. That is actually a pretty cool thing in theory. We're going to talk about the rest in a bit. So as the piston goes up, normally in a normal car, the piston will go up and the rod will swing, change the side load from one side to the other, and then it comes down. Because this rod is so far out, it actually does not swing as much, so it doesn't put side load or thrust load on the sides of the cylinder, which the hope is with that, it's not going to put as much wear over time. And I say the hope is because of the mega complication of this engine. I mean, this short block is extremely complicated. For lack of a better word, you look at it on paper, it is just scary how complicated it is. It is not serviceable separately. It is a unit. Kind of like your air filter, you don't take the one pleat and replace it. The short block in this car, you can't service it. It's one unit. The only thing you can service is the giant motor on the side that activates this whole thing. That is very concerning. I'll be quite frank and honest with you. I love this technology and how it works, but that is a concern. You basically have one thing that goes south. You know, the engine burns oil for whatever reason. You want to put pistons and rings. Well, you can't do that. You have to buy the whole short block. Regardless of everything else, is perfectly fine. They just don't sell you the parts. They don't even show you the procedure how to service it. That's how complicated this is. Manufacturers in normal cars will not do that unless they really feel like this is way too complicated for our technicians to service it. We're not going to get them into that headache. Just replace the whole unit. That's how complicated this is, folks. Now, in addition to this mega complication, there are a few things. This engine has EGR, which is, I thought the whole variable compression thing would get us rid of EGR, but we still have EGR. And then it is, of course, turbocharged. And let's talk about the turbocharging for a second here. It is actually a rather large turbocharger because remember, we have that low compression. We can really get high pressure out of this thing. So the turbocharger is coolant and oil cooled. It sits all the way in the back. I wish it was in the front. That would be a better spot for it, but it is in the back. It does have a electronic wastegate, and it does have a liquid to air intercooler. Intercooler sits right on top. It does have its separate cooling circuit. It does have its own electric water pump. It has its own routing, completely separate cooling system. And speaking of the cooling system, the engine. It has a mechanical water pump. It does have a distribution valve that kind of sends the coolant where it needs to be for fast warm-ups and whatnot, which is pretty cool. Let's talk about the transmission. And I'll give you a second to guess which transmission this Nissan and almost every other Nissan has. Yes, it is a CVT, Xtronic CVT. So Nissan briefly, let's talk about this. Nissan spearheaded the CVT transmission, and successfully, I must say. They really decided they are going all in for CVTs. They were the first ones to put CVTs with a lot of issues in all of their cars. And they really kept at it. And I feel like they have brought the CVT, at least feeling-wise, better. Because this CVT does not drone as much as any other CVT that we've driven from other manufacturers. You can tell that it's a refined CVT from a driving perspective. But unfortunately, with that comes its past reputation. They don't have the best reputation for reliability. This is a new generation of the CVT. I hope that have changed, because this is overall a really nice car. I hope it is a long-term car, although I do have concerns with the engine. Speaking of the engine, let's go back to that for a sec. So this mega complicated engine that still has EGR, even though it has variable compression and everything, it only makes 200 horsepower. Now, some will say, well, it's a 3-cylinder. That's very impressive. But any 4-cylinder engine that is very basic, that doesn't even have a turbo, in 2024, does make 200 horsepower and does make over 225 pound-feet of torque. So I just feel like this is an experiment, and an experiment that is moving in the right direction, but is it really necessary is the question. That's the biggest question I ask, because according to some text that I've been reading about this engine, because I'm really fascinated by it, they have been working on this technology since 1998. 98. I can just stop for a second and think, what is the cost to develop this and actually make it a reality? Because here it is. This is not some weird prototype. This is an everyday car. Now, they have had some issues with the variable compression engines. Some of them are manufacturing, some of them unknown. I hope they get this right and they really reach its full potential, because I don't feel like they have reached its full potential in this particular engine. The only thing is, I will say about this engine, it has a very nice note to it. Something you don't expect out of a 3-cylinder, you don't even expect out of a 4-cylinder with a CVT. Let's take a listen here. That is really impressive. You don't expect a sound like that. Now, it is not a thrilling engine to drive. It actually lugs sometimes, which is annoying. I'm assuming as it's shifting compression, it is lugging a little bit. Now, there are a few interesting observations under the hood. Let's talk about them. Because this is a small engine, the engine mount on the side of it almost feels like it's half the size of the engine itself. The other thing about this engine is it is quiet and smooth, and that is interesting about it. But this is a characteristic of 3-cylinders. It vibrates. Every once in a while, like you accelerate, it just vibrates. And another thing of 3-cylinders, whatever you are used to doing in your other engine at 1500 RPM happens at 2500 RPM. They always run at high RPM. That's how all 3-cylinder engines are, because they need to operate at a higher RPM. Let's take a look underneath the 2024 Nissan Rogue. Now, the first thing is, everything is covered up here. It's not a metal cover, it's more like this fabric. We're seeing a lot of manufacturers use this. The only thing I wish they would not do is leave you a little access for the oil change when we have to kind of take this whole thing off. That's okay, it's not the end of the world. But let's take a look at the front suspension here. A lot of aluminum. Kind of interesting stuff too. Single piston caliper, aluminum knuckle, aluminum lower control arm with a ball joint that's built into it. I wish that was not the case. Makes service easier later. But the interesting thing is, they have a McPherson setup, but it's this style where the shock kind of goes into the knuckle and it gets clamped on. Usually you see that in German cars, but here we are in a Nissan. Interesting design. Now, one thing I like about this, it's not a press-on bearing, it's actually a bolt-on. Although that's going to get seized in the future because of the dissimilar metals, but that's what we have to deal with. Now, there is one thing that is I'm really not happy with. If you roll around, it's going to be hard to show it. But if you look right here, is that a plastic oil pan? Yes, it is. I really wish they would not do stuff like this. And that's, again, they're trying to save weight, probably cost as well, although some of these plastics are really expensive. But wish they wouldn't do stuff like that. Let's move on to the rest of the car, which is, for the most part, decent, except there are a few spots that all the body seam sealer is coming off, which that was not the case. Now, there's something interesting about this car. When you open the door, it has this puddle light and big light. You can actually see it here. This whole thing lights up, and then you have this little lens that, you know, spells out Nissan. It's a nice feature, but the problem is you got to be careful when you lift this car, because you could easily crush that, and there goes the nice stuff. Then we look at the catalytic converter. This is something very interesting about this catalytic converter. I'm actually wondering, so I tried to look it up, but we could not really get to a conclusive thing. You see this? This does not look like an O2 sensor. This actually looks like a temperature probe. Does Nissan have a temperature probe? So old Japanese cars in Japan they were mandated to have this. Are we back to it in the US? That is kind of interesting. Now, Nissan's exhaust usually is not the highest quality, but this one, it just has a distinct look to it. I like it. It's a move in the right direction. It definitely feels better than everything we've seen from Nissan. So that is really good. As we move our way back, you have a saddle tank right here with a kind of a heavier duty shield on it with plastic clips. This is, of course, I think this is a better idea, because you put balls that corrode and this thing will fall down. But behind that is the differential and kind of the actuator that actuates it. Here's that motor. This is what engages all-wheel drive. So basically the transfer case is always spinning the drive shaft. This is the disconnect mechanism to vary the all-wheel drive and take it out completely. Let's look at the rear suspension. Kind of double wishbone-ish suspension. You look at the top, aluminum control arm at the top, and then aluminum sway bar link. Same thing in the front. We didn't talk about it, but the rest is steel. The knuckle is aluminum as well. We do have a single piston caliper that is with the electronic park and brake on it. It's an electronic motor. That is pretty much the standard of the automotive industry. This is why I say I don't like these in cars. Look how open this is. I mean, you got these two connectors here. You got, for the blind spot monitor right there, that's the blind spot monitor sensor. This will get loaded with mud and all kinds of stuff when you drive. I don't know why they do this. Same thing here, it's wide open. Now the exhaust has a pretty interesting, it's a pretty large diameter one, but it has this little flap. I wonder what that does. And then it also has this. I wonder if this is some kind of protection if you back into it or anything for accidents. Interesting setup. But the rear subframe is all steel. It is actually a dual subframe. I really like that. Tiny differential. Again, this is not for any off-roading or anything. It works. I like everything I see here for the most part. Let's take a look at the outside of the Nissan Rogue. So Nissan always tried to make their cars interesting looking, and in my opinion, successfully so. They followed a very simple recipe. We're going to try to not copy everybody else, and we're going to establish a fascia that looks nice and copy and paste to all our models. And usually that doesn't work with manufacturers, but it somehow works for Nissan. This is not going to be a showstopper car, but it's actually not a bad looking car either. At least in my humble opinion. I really like their new logo, how it is not the typical silver. It kind of blends into every design. The one thing that is interesting, they have the headlights here. They are not projector headlights. They are LEDs, but they're not projector headlights. But if you notice, they actually have kind of a design that comes this way and then goes down and then comes back. You really have to focus to see it, but I think it gives it a pretty interesting look. It just has a little bit of a utilitarian look, a little bit of sophistication. I think it looks pretty good in the front. And then we look at the design of the hood. They didn't go overboard. This is what I say, less is more with design. There's just a line here, it kind of curves a little bit, and that's about it. There's not 17 lines here. Then we go to the side. This is the platinum trim. This is one of the higher trims here. This is not body color, but it is piano black. I really like the finish on it. It does look nice, and that is really cool. They also did the roof in black, kind of gives it a different contrast. That is pretty interesting. Pretty large mirror for a car of this size. I really like that for function. Then we look at the side. There isn't a lot going on in the side. There's just this little panel at the bottom, a little bit of chrome on it, but the doors, there is not much going on in them. And that is the whole point. You do have this little line that appears here and then goes all the way to the back to kind of tie into the back. It has a very Nissan look to it. But something about this car that is very interesting. This still has a button for the door lock. You don't have touch sensors. Wish that was not the case. They just updated this. They didn't. But what they did do very right. Just look at the angle of this door. Why does every single car made today in 24 not have this angle? The only other car we've reviewed so far that has this angle was the Mazda CX-90, CX-70. This makes entrance super easy. I wish every manufacturer would do this. Now the other thing they do here that is cool, this car has accent lighting on the outside. The one we looked at when we were underneath it, I think that was pretty cool. It does make service a little bit interesting, but I think that was pretty cool. Then we look around the back. If I hide these two, 90%, even if you're remotely into cars, you will know this is a Nissan. It just has a look. Nissan has a design language that hasn't changed in a while. It looks like a Nissan. There are certain things that Nissan does not do and follow the others. Things like this has a giant bumper. Unlike most new cars that basically the bumper stops right here, you hit a tiny little thing and damages the door. This has a giant bumper. So you have a little bit of protection. Somebody backs into your car, somebody hits you and you're stopped. You have room. That is really cool. Now, they kept it for the most part simple. I like that these are actually not chrome. They follow the color of their new logo. It's like this matte silver or matte gray. I like that. They just have the trim, all-wheel drive. We don't need to write VC turbo 1.5 3. We don't need to write that. Some manufacturers get really carried away, but they have one interesting decision here. So when you walk up to this car, if this is your first time walking up to it, you're going to come here to try to open it, except the door is all the way down here. Like if you were in an Armada, for example, it's a much bigger, higher truck. This makes sense because this would be like here, but this is, you have to kind of bend down. Not the end of the world, but it's a small observation. Power door, of course. Here's something interesting for you. We're starting to see this a lot more in other manufacturers, but Nissan does it proper. This is a motor. You can see the wire right here. And this is also a motor, which means over time this door will not twist. And that is a good thing. We've seen a lot of manufacturers put one motor and the other one is just a fake one, just a shock. And then the door twists as it goes up and over time it bends. I like that, but I don't like it. It's a small thing. Why does the wire go into the body? If you ever need to replace these, you have to tear into half the car to replace that. Wish it would have been not here. It would have been on the other side going into the door, since we already have wires going to the door. I don't know why manufacturers do that, but they do. Not the end of the world, it's the small stuff. Here, I really like what this material that they used here. Usually car manufacturers will just put the cheapest plastic here. I mean, this is not a luxury car, but I like that they lined this. You know, usually you get super cheapo plastic kind of like this here. You just touch it and it scratches and there's that. This is a little bit more forgiving. Now, this deal here, I really don't like. Maybe I don't know how to operate it. Don't mind me, but it's just, I wish this was just not like that. It does, once you figure out how to work it, yes, a spare tire with insulation right next to it. I like that. I really like that. This area is a very usable space, which is lined really nice. I like that you have handles right here to lower the second row seat. You don't need to reach in and do all that. Now these mats, I really like these mats. See, most manufacturers, when they put their OEM mats, this is just a mess. I like that these have Velcro. You can remove them individually should you need to. This is really nice. And the last thing is, you can close the door and close it and lock it. This is really cool. Let's talk about the interior of the 2024 Nissan Rogue. And this is where this truly shines. They really did this part exceptionally well. I mean, let's start with the basics. The seats. This is one of the most comfortable seats I have been in many cars that we have reviewed now. Not only is it a comfortable seat, the foam is soft. It's a plush seat. I haven't seen a plush seat in new cars in a long time. The other thing is, it has this really nice diamond stitching in it. I mean, you don't expect to see stuff like that in a car in this segment at this price. You just don't. And then you look at the dash. It is not a super over-the-top design dash, but the simple design that it has is very elegant and nice looking. Folks, this is what people want. They don't want over the top in this segment of cars. They just want basic, something nice to look at, but not over the top. But the main thing is, it does not intrude on your functionality. I mean, you look at the HVAC controls. I love how they are very wide, right in front of you. It has a little screen, but everything else is physical button touch. You don't have to think more than half a second to operate it. It's right in front of you and everything is there. Infotainment screen, volume knob is right in the middle, so you can reach it and your passenger can reach it if you don't want to operate the super simple to operate steering wheel, which I really like. The infotainment screen itself, or the infotainment system, is not the best, it's not the worst. A little bit glitchy, sometimes slows down, but overall it's acceptable. We're not buying some luxury car here. This is a normal car for everyday people. Visibility here is super nice. I'm really impressed by this interior. I mean, folks, you really got to give it a thought. You don't expect a well thought out interior in this segment. You just expect it to be a blob of plastic that works. This is not a blob of plastic. It's not only well thought out, it is actually on the nice side of things. Feels out of this segment. I really like that. And with that, there are a few interesting things. So the gauge is all screen, and usually I'm really against these because all they do is mimic two big gauges that we could have had mechanical, add more cost to the car, and they do absolutely nothing. Not here though. You can actually display your map here. Usually luxury cars do that, and some of them don't even do that. This one you can display your map, which is really helpful. You can keep your eye on the road and glance at your map without having to look on the side. And the other thing is the shifter. This is the only part that I don't like about this interior. I feel like we are mimicking a regular shifter with a button on the side and park at the top. It's not the most annoying shifter on the planet, but if we've taken all this real estate, why don't we just put a regular cable shifter? Would have worked exactly the same. I don't know what happened there. The other thing is, which I really like, auto hold, brake hold. So most cars, for reasons I don't understand, every time you get in the car, you have to turn it back on again. This one, you turn it on once, you shut off the car, start it again. It's still on until you shut it off. That's, I think, how it should be, and that's how Nissan does it. Start button is kind of an interesting spot right here, not when where you expected. This is something you can get used to, I believe. I wish it was still here. That would have been nicer. But something interesting, the ambient lighting situation. And I call it a situation because that's what it is. So you have ambient lighting on the door and on the footrest, but you can only change the color in the footrest. And the way you change it is very interesting, which I actually welcome that. Usually you expect stuff like that. You got to go through some menu and find it and whatnot. Not this one. Even this part is basic. In the center console, you have a button to turn them on or off or change the color. You will never find it simpler than that, because that's how simple it needs to be. I love it. I really love their approach of simplicity and elegance at the same time. This interior will shock you. It shocked me. I was not expecting it to be this nice, honestly. But this is truly nice, and they really done this one well. Let's talk about the second row seat in the Rogue. I'm 5'7". This is my driving position. I have decent knee room. I have decent headroom, even though this has a panoramic sunroof. So the special thing about this back seat is how plush these seats are. Folks, this reminds me from cars from the 90s, how the foam is soft. We're moving towards making every grocery getter car that is really good at doing that into a sports car, and seats are getting harder and harder and less comfortable. Not this one, and I really appreciate that. The biggest thing is that the hump in the middle is actually low. This is a very comfortable place to be. You do have heated seats here. You do have some HVAC vents. You even have a shade, which is difficult to engage with the window open, but you usually don't see this in cars in this particular segment. This is really helpful if you have little babies, so the sun wouldn't hit their eyes. I like this. See, they're thinking. They're not putting gimmicks here. I love this interior all around. They really did this one well. Let's talk about some things I do not like about the Nissan Rogue. And I have to say one thing. I really like this. This is a very impressive SUV once you get to sit in it and drive it. However, nothing is perfect in life, and we have to highlight a few things. First one is the engine. The engine has an okay feel. Let's put it this way. It lugs a little bit. It feels pushed, and that is the one thing about it. But the biggest concern with it is it's mega complicated, that short block. That variable compression technology, while it is very impressive from an engineering standpoint, but in the real world, and when you add people don't take care of their cars and bad maintenance habits and kind of driving conditions, I don't know how it's going to fare long term. I hope it fares really well because it is beautiful technology. But the fact that you can't service a short block kind of compromises the long term reliability of this. Basically, anything happens with it, even if it's something tiny, you have to replace the whole short block. That is a little bit of a concern. Second thing is the CVT transmission. Although in its later iteration and kind of the latest generation of CVTs, and Nissan really spearheaded the CVTs almost bankrupting themselves because they had a lot of issues initially. Things have been a little bit better lately, but I hope this new generation holds. But again, it is a concern, and the truths have to be said. Lastly, the suspension. It's not a big deal, but this is such a nice car that I don't know why it is this way. So it's a super smooth suspension, super quiet ride. You go over kind of hard bumps. It almost feels like something is broken or loose in the suspension, but there's nothing broken or loose. That's just how it's tuned. It's too crashy. It makes noise over hard bumps. I've noticed this with a lot of Nissans. It may be something with the way they tune their suspension, but that would be a really nice improvement if we got rid of that for a car that drives as nice as the Rogue does. So should you buy a 2024 Nissan Rogue? There's no other way to say it. This is a truly impressive SUV. I just have to say the truth here. See, it's very understated on the outside. It does look good, but it's not over the top. And that's what I like about it. But where this car truly shines is in the interior. They managed to get it super sensible, but at the same time, very nice looking and very comfortable. And usually you get a car in this segment, they're not quiet. They're actually on the loud side. And that's what people expect. It's, this segment, it's not a luxury. This one, very impressive installation. I really like it. I like that it's functional and nice. You can get both. And not only on the high trim like this one, even when you get into the lower trims, they're still nice. And their prices don't reflect that they are nice. They're actually decently priced. And that is the biggest thing that the Rogue has going for it. It's one of the most important models. It's kind of flies under the radar for most, but those that buy it, they know what they're buying, because what you're buying here is value, and I really like what it offers. Now, nothing is perfect in life, and we have to address the good stuff and the bad stuff and the concerning stuff. Let's put it this way. The engine, feeling-wise, is just okay. It's not going to impress you at all. And to think of the level of complication that had to happen, although I love the engineering behind it, but unfortunately the real world and engineering on a paper don't always get along. The mega level of complication of this engine is a concern long term. It's a new technology. It is exclusive to Nissan, not something that everybody else is doing. And the lack of serviceability on the short block is a little bit of a concern long term. And then the CVT transmission. Nissan has stuck out with the CVT transmission for a very long time, sometimes against their reputation, just trying to prove a point. And this is a new generation of the CVT in the Rogue. I hope it holds, because truly they have really gotten the CVT very good, feeling-wise, but reliability-wise, time will tell if the new generation of the CVTs will hold, unlike their predecessors, which did not hold very well. And the last thing is the suspension. I wish they would tweak the suspension because this is such a nice ride. Other than when you crash into some bigger bumps, it just feels like something is broken. I've noticed this with multiple Nissan models. It's not just this one. It's just the way they tune the suspension. It handles great. It is smooth. It is comfortable. It is beautiful. But just that feeling of something rattling almost, like when you hit big bumps. I wish they would take care of that. Folks, I hope this video is helpful, informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. And until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you. And you have yourself a wonderful day.